before the sails were raised, before maps were redrawn. The world already carried its own quiet rhythm. Europe in the 15th century was a continent of contrasts: stone cities and wooden villages, candlelit churches and muddy streets, the clatter of horse hooves and the whisper of parchment in monastic halls. Far across an ocean that many still believed was endless, life followed an entirely different cadence. On islands of sunlight and water, families gathered to share cassava bread. Children played along white sands, and fishermen sang as they hauled nets from turquoise seas. This chapter is not about discovery or conquest. It is about the world before. The world that existed quietly, in its own completeness, before two horizons touched. In Europe, the 15th century was a time of patient routine. A farmer woke before dawn. The first sound he heard was often the bleating of livestock or the faint crow of a rooster. The air smelled of damp earth, smoke from last night's fire, and the sharp tang of manure. He pulled on heavy wool, sometimes patched many times, and stepped into fields divided by hedges and stone walls. Peasants worked long hours, bending to pull weeds, till furrows, or guide oxen pulling a plough. Women spun flax into coarse cloth, tended gardens, and baked bread in communal ovens. Children gathered firewood, fetched water, and learned trades by watching their elders. Life was seasonal. In spring, ploughing and planting. In summer, weeding and tending. Autumn brought harvests, feasts and fairs. Winter was a time of mending, conserving, and waiting. The rhythm of bells ordered time. Church bells for prayer, market bells for trade, curfew bells to signal night. In quiet monasteries, monks bent over parchment, their pens, cut from goose feathers, scratched slowly across vellum. Illuminated letters, curled in red and gold, a patient art that required hours for a single page. The scriptorium was silent, but for the sound of breathing and scratching ink. Candles dripped wax. Dust floated in beams of light through narrow windows. Books were rare, fragile, and precious. A monk might spend years copying the Bible, or the works of ancient philosophers, preserving words that would outlast kingdoms. For many ordinary villagers, the written word was distant, but for the monasteries, words were a bridge to eternity. Elsewhere, in the growing towns of Europe, markets bustled with sound. Bakers carried baskets of dark rye bread. Butchers sold salted pork and smoked sausages. Merchants traded wool, linen, and pottery. Street musicians played fiddles and pipes for coins. The smell of fish mixed with the smell of ale, spices, and horse dung. For those with coin, imported goods from far away appeared in stalls: pepper from India, silks from the Levant, and sugar carried at great expense. Every object hinted at worlds beyond Europe's shores, worlds most villagers would never see, but which shaped their imagination. In Spain, 1492 would be remembered for many reasons. Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, had just fallen. Ferdinand and Isabella, monarchs of Castile and Aragon, now ruled a unified kingdom. Flags bearing crosses fluttered above citadels once marked by crescents. The mood in Spain was one of momentum, a sense that new doors were opening, not only on land but also at sea. Wealth from trade, prestige from conquest, and dreams of spreading faith all combined to make Spain restless. The oceans, long seen as dangerous barriers, began to look like pathways. But across the Atlantic, life carried its own steady pulse. The Taino people of the Caribbean lived in villages surrounded by palm groves and rivers. Their homes, called bohíos, were round and thatched with palm leaves. Inside, hammocks were strung from posts, swaying gently in the evening breeze. Days began with sunlight shimmering on the sea. Fishermen paddled canoes carved from single trees, casting nets woven from cotton. Women tended gardens of cassava, maize, and beans, grinding roots into bread that baked on flat stones. Children played in shallow waters, laughing as they chased crabs or painted their bodies with dyes. Elders sat beneath trees, telling stories that blended memory with myth. For the Taino, the islands were not boundaries. They were part of a wide web of canoes, trade, and kinship. Each island was linked by sea routes known for generations. Both Europe and the Caribbean lived in worlds filled with spirits, though differently understood. In Europe, the church bell called villagers to mass. Statues of saints stood in quiet chapels, painted eyes watching candles burn low. Faith was both comfort and command. For many, the church ordered the year, Lent, Easter, feasts of saints, Advent. In the Caribbean, rituals honoured zemis, ancestral spirits and gods carved into stone or wood. Offerings of fruit, tobacco and song maintained harmony with the unseen world. Shamans, called bahikis, guided ceremonies that linked people with nature, with rain, with harvest, with ancestors. Two faiths, separated by an ocean, both taught that the world was not just material, but spiritual. For centuries, these two worlds turned, unaware of one another. Europe lived within maps that stopped at the edges of the Atlantic. The Caribbean lived within horizons bounded by blue seas and distant islands. Both worlds were whole, complete in themselves. Neither felt unfinished, neither felt in need of the other. The story of Columbus is often told as a beginning, but before any beginning, there is a before, a fullness of life that deserves its own remembering. As the 15th century drew to its close, the world waited in silence. Europe's bells still rang, Caribbean waves still broke on quiet shores. No one knew that soon, sails would rise on the horizon, sails that would carry more than men. They would carry change. But here, in this first chapter, we remain in the stillness before. A world whole in itself, unbroken, balanced, waiting. Every life begins small, before the sails, before the voyage, before the name became ink on every map. Christopher Columbus was a boy. He was not born to command fleets nor to stand before kings. He was born among stone streets and salt air in the port city of Genoa, a place where the sea itself was a kind of teacher, always present, always restless. The story of the New World often begins with ships and discovery, but here it begins with a child, watching the harbour, his life shaped not by destiny but by water, by wind, by the quiet discipline of survival in a maritime town. Genoa in the 15th century was a city of stone and water, narrow streets twisted uphill, lined with tall houses that leaned close, as if whispering to each other. Laundry hung across alleys. The smell of fish, tar and spices filled the air. Down by the docks, life was noisier. Ships from distant ports crowded the harbour, their masts a forest of wood and rope. Sailors shouted as they hauled cargo. Merchants counted coins and scribbled tallies on parchment. The sea slapped against the hulls, steady and endless. For a boy like Columbus, the harbour was a place of wonder. Each ship carried not only goods but stories, of lands he had never seen, of seas he could only imagine. He grew up hearing them all. Columbus was born into a family of wool weavers. His father Domenico worked at a loom, carding and spinning, weaving thread into cloth. The rhythm of weaving was steady, like the ticking of a clock. Over, under, back, forth. His mother, Susanna, kept the household, cooking simple meals of bread, olives, beans and fish. But though the family trade was wool, young Christopher was drawn more strongly to the sea. Genoa's walls could not hold his imagination. His hands itched not for wool but for ropes, not for shuttles but for sails. Still he learned the discipline of craft from his father. Patience, repetition, endurance, traits that would follow him across oceans. By his teens, Columbus was already working near the docks. He learned to mend sails, to coil ropes, to patch leaks with tar. He carried buckets, scrubbed decks, and listened. Sailors told stories of storms in the Atlantic, of merchant routes to Flanders and England, of spices and silks from the east. The boy absorbed these tales like water soaks into cloth. The sea became more than just a horizon. It became a vast, mysterious stage, where fortunes rose and vanished with the wind. At night, when the harbour quieted, he walked the quays and watched the stars shimmer above the dark water. They looked like lanterns guiding unseen travellers. The sea had its own vocabulary, and Columbus learned it early. The pull of the tide, the creak of a hull, the way ropes sang under strain. The smell of tar was constant, warm, sharp, sticking to skin and hair. Salt crusted on clothes after a long day near the spray. Splinters pierced fingers. Blisters formed and hardened. The boy grew strong not from play but from labour. He hauled, scrubbed, climbed, until the rhythm of the sea became as natural to him as breath. He learned to read weather in the colour of clouds, to sense danger in the sudden silence of gulls. Every detail became part of him, the quiet education of a sailor. Yet even as he worked, Columbus's imagination drifted farther than most. Many boys laboured at the docks, many men became sailors, but Columbus wanted something more than wages. He wanted distance. He wanted to know what lay beyond the horizon. In Genoa, maps were not like ours today. They were half-formed, full of guesses. Seas ended in dragons, coastlines stopped abruptly. For Columbus, these unfinished maps were not frightening. They were invitations. Where ink ended, he imagined possibility. By his late teens, Columbus had gone to sea. These were not yet voyages of discovery, but of trade, of survival. He sailed in merchant fleets carrying wool, wine, or grain to ports along the Mediterranean. The sea was not gentle. Storms rose suddenly, winds snapped masts, waves tossed ships like toys. Columbus learned fear and how to move through it. He learned to trust the captain's orders, to lash himself to rigging if the storm grew too fierce, to cling to the rhythm of survival. But he also learned awe. On calm nights, when the water lay flat as glass, he saw stars multiply endlessly across the sky. He saw bioluminescent waves glow with green fire. He felt the sea as something vast, alive, and endless. The voyages took him farther than most of his neighbours would ever travel. He saw Lisbon with its high towers, Valencia with its markets, Tunis with its whitewashed walls. Each port had its own smell, its own sound. Lisbon smelled of spices and wine. Tunis smelled of desert dust and salt. Valencia rang with bells, shouts, and the cries of merchants. The boy from Genoa was becoming a man of many harbours. Each city added to his knowledge, not just of trade, but of the variety of the human world. Different languages, different coins, different ways of dressing. All these differences stirred his imagination. One voyage nearly ended Columbus's story before it began. Off the coast of Portugal, his ship was attacked by pirates. Flames rose, arrows flew, men leapt into the sea. Columbus himself plunged into the water, swimming toward the distant shore. He clung to wreckage, pulled by tide and willpower. When at last he staggered onto land, exhausted but alive, he had been marked by the sea. He knew its danger firsthand. Yet he returned, undeterred. For him, survival only deepened the bond. Eventually Columbus settled for a time in Lisbon, Portugal. Here he married, here he studied charts and nautical instruments, here he listened to the tales of Portuguese explorers pushing down the coast of Africa. Lisbon was a hub of maps and rumours. In taverns, sailors spoke of islands far into the Atlantic, of currents that seemed to pull ships westward, of gold and spices waiting to be found. Columbus spent long nights bent over maps, tracing coastlines, dreaming of what might lie just beyond. Thus the boy of Genoa became a sailor. He was not yet the figure history would remember. He was simply one of many, a man shaped by salt, wind, and labour. But even in these early years, something in him was restless, reaching, unwilling to be bound by the edges of the map. And so, long before he sailed west, long before his name was etched into every atlas, Christopher Columbus was already moving toward the horizon, one step, one voyage, one tide at a time. The 15th century was an age of thresholds. To most of Europe, the sea was still a boundary, a wall of salt water that marked the limits of imagination. To sail too far was to risk falling into nothingness, or into the jaws of sea monsters painted on the edges of maps. But to some, the sea was beginning to look different. Not a wall, but a doorway. Not an end, but a beginning. This was the age when currents were studied, when winds were charted, when coastlines slowly unfolded like pages of a book. It was an age when the ocean, vast, restless and mysterious, began to open itself to human persistence. Portugal led the way, its sailors, patient and determined, pushed down the western coast of Africa year after year. At first they hugged the shoreline, afraid to lose sight of land. Each promontory, each cape was given a name, often born of hardship. Cape Bojador, Cape Verde, the Gulf of Guinea. They discovered patterns in the winds, the trade winds blowing steadily from the northeast, the return currents that circled back toward Europe. Slowly a network of knowledge formed. It was not heroic in the moment. It was often tedious, dangerous, repetitive, but it built a bridge of understanding across waters that had once been feared. As these voyages accumulated, so too did the maps. In workshops, cartographers bent over parchment, sketching coastlines with ink and compass. Each new voyage added a small line, a new bay, a corrected angle. The maps of the 1400s were not yet accurate, but they were alive, always changing. For those who studied them, the maps were not just tools, they were promises. Each blank space whispered of what might be discovered. Riches, islands, new kingdoms. And yet the blankness was also comforting. It left room for the imagination to wander, for dreams to grow larger than facts. While Portugal looked south, Spain turned west. The year was 1492. Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, had fallen. The Reconquista was complete. The banners of Ferdinand and Isabella now flew over every corner of their unified kingdom. For centuries, Spain's energy had been directed inward, reclaiming land piece by piece. Now, with victory won, that energy sought new directions. The monarchy was eager to secure its place among the rising powers of Europe. Wealth, prestige, and faith all called for new frontiers. The ocean, long regarded as a threatening void, began to shimmer with possibility. For those who dared the sea, it taught in small lessons. The pull of the tides, the shift of the stars, the way swells rolled differently in deep water than near the shore. Sailors learned to trust the colour of the sea, greenish where shallow, deep blue where endless. They learned to feel the wind in their bones, to predict storms by the sudden stillness of air. These were not lessons from books, but from experience. Each voyage was a classroom, each storm a stern teacher. Slowly, a body of practical knowledge grew, passed down in whispers, in gestures, in habits repeated until they became instinct. At the heart of this age of exploration was something surprisingly small: spices. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves. Tiny seeds and dried barks that carried enormous value. In European kitchens, they were symbols of wealth. A pinch of pepper could flavour an entire pot of stew. A sprinkle of cinnamon transformed bread into luxury. But the routes that carried spices from Asia were long, dangerous, and controlled by intermediaries. Every hand that touched the cargo added to its cost. European monarchs dreamed of bypassing the middlemen, of finding direct routes by sea. Thus, the ocean became not only a mystery, but an opportunity. Even before Columbus dreamed of sailing west, sailors spoke of islands. There were whispers of the Azores, Madeira and the Canaries, stepping stones into the Atlantic. Some said there were more islands still, hidden by mist, glimpsed and then lost again. Stories spread of St. Brendan's Isle, a mythical land said to rise and vanish with the fog, of Antillia, the island of the seven cities, where bishops had fled centuries before. These stories blurred the line between fact and fable, but they gave shape to the ocean's emptiness. For sailors like Columbus, they suggested that the Atlantic was not void, but dotted with resting places. If there were islands half seen, might there be continents unseen? This age of exploration was not only about wealth, it was also about faith. For monarchs like Ferdinand and Isabella, each voyage carried the hope of spreading Christianity, converting new peoples, expanding the reach of the church. These were seen as duties as much as opportunities. Thus, when sailors spoke of distant lands, kings and queens heard not just profit but mission. The sea was a place where commerce and devotion intertwined, where ships carried both goods and crosses. It was into this world that Christopher Columbus matured. He was not alone in dreaming of the sea. He was part of a generation restless with horizons, alive with rumours of new routes. But where others saw limits, Columbus imagined openings. The age was ripe for men like him, men who could see the sea not as a barrier but as a bridge. The 15th century was an age of portals. Maps expanded, winds were charted, coastlines stretched. The sea was no longer only a boundary, it was becoming a door. On one side stood Europe, eager, searching, restless. On the other side lay worlds unseen, complete in themselves, waiting without knowing they were about to be touched, and in between stretched the Atlantic,
vast, patient, silent, holding within it both separation and possibility. Dreams alone do not launch ships. No matter how vivid a vision might be, it requires sails, timber, supplies, and men willing to risk their lives. And behind all of those things lies something even more essential: money. In the late 15th century, voyages of discovery were not private adventures. They were undertakings that required royal blessing, noble investment, and clerical approval. A sailor might dream of new worlds, but without patrons to underwrite the cost, he would never leave the dock. For Christopher Columbus, this would become his great trial. To convince rulers and courts that what he imagined was not only possible but profitable. To imagine the scale of what Columbus was asking, we must think not in abstract numbers, but in practical needs. A ship required skilled carpenters to shape its hull, ropes thick as a man's wrist, sails of linen cut and stitched by hand. Food for weeks, hardtack, salted meat, casks of water and wine, had to be stored, weapons for defence, anchors, compasses, astrolabes, and spare timber for repairs. Every detail meant silver. A single voyage might consume the wealth of a merchant's lifetime, and Columbus was not asking for one ship, but for several. Not for a short journey, but for a leap into the unknown. To most financiers, it was not an investment, but a gamble. Columbus first turned to Portugal. It was the natural choice. Lisbon was the beating heart of Europe's seafaring world. Portuguese sailors had rounded Cape Bojador, reached as far as the Gulf of Guinea, and were edging ever closer to India by sailing around Africa. But when Columbus presented his plan, to reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic, the Portuguese court hesitated. Their experts believed the ocean was far wider than Columbus imagined. They trusted their established path, south around Africa, where progress was steady and measurable. Some historians suggest that Portugal even tested Columbus's idea in secret, sending a ship westward. If so, the vessel returned quickly, battered and empty-handed, confirming their doubts. For Columbus, it was rejection. To live as a petitioner was to endure humiliation. Christopher Columbus was not a nobleman. He did not command armies or estates. He was a sailor, asking kings to stake their treasure on his vision. He learned to wait in corridors, to bow before courtiers, to speak carefully before theologians who questioned not only his mathematics but his faith. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. His letters multiplied, his proposals rephrased again and again. At times his dream must have felt like sand slipping through his fingers, present in imagination, but always out of reach in reality. After rejection in Portugal, Columbus turned to Spain. The timing was precarious. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile were consumed by the final war of the Reconquista. Every coin was directed toward the siege of Granada. Every court session echoed with the demands of war. Yet even here Columbus pressed his case. He argued not only for wealth, but for faith. If Asia could be reached by sailing west, then Christian Europe could outflank Islam, opening direct contact with the Great Khan, perhaps even reclaiming Jerusalem. His plan became not just commerce, but crusade. In Spain, his proposal was examined by a board of scholars and clerics. They gathered in Salamanca, weighing his claims against scripture, against the writings of Aristotle and Ptolemy. Columbus argued the earth was smaller than most believed, that Asia lay just a short voyage west. His opponents countered with the weight of accepted knowledge. The ocean was vast, perhaps endless. For years the debate swayed back and forth. Columbus pressed his vision with confidence, even arrogance. His critics resisted, but could never fully dismiss him. His persistence became part of his case. For Columbus, these were years of wandering. He moved from town to town, from monastery to palace. He sought audiences, wrote letters, cultivated allies. Sometimes he found sympathy. A friar who admired his determination, a courtier who whispered encouragement. But sympathy was not enough. His children grew in Seville, his wife had died. He lived often in poverty, sustained only by his unshakable belief. Where others might have abandoned the dream, he clung to it as if it were his very identity. It was not merely a plan of exploration. It was his destiny, and he refused to let it die. In January 1492, Granada fell. The Reconquista was complete. The banners of Castile and Aragon flew over the Alhambra. Suddenly Spain had both resources and attention to spare. The monarchy, flush with victory, could now look outward. It was in this moment, after years of rejection, that Columbus's case found fertile ground. Even then the negotiations were tense. Columbus demanded titles: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Governor of any lands discovered, a share of profits. To many courtiers, these demands seemed absurd from a man who owned nothing but his conviction. But Isabella, persuaded by trusted advisers, and by her own sense of divine mission, at last agreed. The capitulations of Santa Fe were signed. Columbus's dream would have its chance. For years, Columbus had lived in corridors, dismissed, doubted, and humiliated. He had carried his dream like a burden, unshaken by the weight of rejection. Now, at last, he held the promise of ships and men. But promises are not yet voyages. The ocean still waited, vast and silent, demanding proof. The dream had found patrons. The vision had found its chance, and soon the sails would rise. The day finally came when vision left parchment and became wood, sail, and rope. For nearly 2 decades, Christopher Columbus had carried the weight of his dream across courts and monasteries, across rejection and ridicule. Now, with the backing of Ferdinand and Isabella, the seas themselves lay before him. But a voyage is not only an idea, it is flesh and labour, storms and salt. It is men who doubt, ships that creak, supplies that rot. The Atlantic is no tame water. It is endless, consuming, merciless. And in 1492 to sail into it was to step beyond the edge of certainty into mystery. The fleet was modest. 3 ships, hardly fit to carry the weight of history. The Niña, a nimble caravel, light and fast. The Pinta, another caravel, quick but troublesome, with sails and rudder that would test her crew. The Santa Maria, a larger now, heavier and slower, chosen by Columbus as his flagship. They were not mighty vessels of empire, but working ships of trade and fishing, pressed into service for a voyage no merchant would have dared attempt. About 90 men joined the voyage. They came not as heroes, but as reluctant adventurers, sailors drawn from Andalusian ports, prisoners freed on the promise of pardon, vagabonds seeking escape, and a handful of experienced seamen. Most did not share Columbus's conviction. To them, it was simply a dangerous gamble, undertaken because wages were promised and debts forgiven. They carried their doubts with them, whispering of monsters said to dwell in uncharted seas, of ships that would never return. Yet they went, for hunger, for desperation, or for the faint hope of fortune. The provisioning was hasty. Barrels of salted meat, beans, hardtack, casks of water and wine, oil and vinegar. Livestock crowded the decks, pigs and chickens for fresh meat, though their noise and smell would soon sour the voyage. On the morning of August 3rd, 1492, the sails were raised. The bells of Palos tolled, families wept on the shore, and the 3 ships slipped from the harbour, heading westward into waters no European fleet had dared. At first, the journey seemed ordinary. The ships followed familiar routes, hugging the coasts of Spain and the Canary Islands. Repairs were made, sails adjusted, tempers kept in check. But beyond the Canaries there were no more safe harbours, only the wide Atlantic rolling endlessly. To sail into it was to unmoor from the world. Each sunrise revealed nothing but water. Each sunset left the horizon unchanged. The men began to count the days not as progress, but as distance from safety. As weeks passed, murmurs spread among the crew. Some claimed the compass was behaving strangely, its needle no longer pointing true north. Others feared they were caught in an enchanted sea, carried southward by invisible currents. Still others whispered of sea monsters and endless waters from which no ship had ever returned. Columbus himself kept 2 sets of logs. One recorded the true distance travelled, the other, shown to the crew, reduced the numbers, making the voyage seem shorter. It was a quiet deception, meant to keep fear from blooming into mutiny. There came a period when the winds died. The ocean stilled into a mirror, sails hung limp, the ships drifting helplessly. To sailors who depended on wind, this calm was more terrifying than storms. Without movement, they felt trapped in a silent prison, surrounded by endless water. Men prayed, cursed, quarrelled. The food began to rot. Thirst grew sharp. Mutiny simmered beneath the surface. But then the winds returned, carrying them west once more. In late September, hints began to appear. A branch drifting in the water, carved wood, fresh weeds floating on the surface. Birds appeared, first a lone gull, then flocks moving steadily westward. The men's hearts quickened. Columbus spoke of islands just beyond the horizon, of Asia's shores within reach. The crew, desperate for hope, clung to every sign. Yet as days passed without sight of land, despair returned. By October the crew had reached their breaking point. Angry voices rose demanding that they turn back. Some threatened violence against Columbus himself. In that moment his years of persistence bore fruit. He spoke with conviction, promising that land lay near, urging patience for just a few more days. His authority, his sheer force of will, held them together on the edge of collapse. It was a fragile victory. One more disappointment, and the voyage might have ended in mutiny. On the night of October 11th, 1492, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana spotted a faint light on the horizon. At dawn the cry came, "Tierra! Tierra! Land!" The ship surged forward. The men wept, embraced, shouted prayers. Weeks of terror and doubt dissolved in that single moment. They had crossed the Atlantic. They had reached a new world. The island was lush, green, and alive with people. The native Taino greeted the newcomers with gifts and hospitality, unarmed and curious. Columbus named the island San Salvador, Holy Saviour. To him, it was proof of divine favour, the fulfilment of his destiny. To the sailors, it was salvation from fear and despair. But beneath the joy of discovery lay shadows of what was to come. For the meeting of worlds would not remain peaceful for long. The voyage had begun as a gamble, doubted by kings, resisted by sailors, threatened by mutiny. Against storms and calms, against fear and despair, the ships had pressed on. Now they had crossed the ocean. They had found land where maps showed only sea, but this was only the beginning. For the world they had entered was not Asia, as Columbus believed. It was something far larger, a continent unknown to Europe, rich with peoples, stories, and tragedies yet to unfold. The first voyage had ended in triumph, but history had only just begun. The voyage had carried them further than they could ever have imagined. Days blurred into nights, nights into dawns, until the very notion of time seemed to dissolve into the steady rhythm of the sea. And then, at last, the line of the horizon broke. A shimmer of green, a suggestion of trees where none had been before, a whisper that the maps did not know. For the men on the ships, this first sighting of land was not greeted with shouts and cheers alone, but with a long, stunned silence. After weeks of nothing but sea and sky, to suddenly glimpse earth rising from the water was like beholding a vision. Their minds strained to comprehend it. Had they truly sailed beyond the limits of their known world? Had they stepped into a place no sailor of Castile or Aragon had ever touched? The sails were lowered, ropes drawn tight, and the ships drifted closer. The shoreline revealed itself more clearly. Low hills draped in greenery, palm-like fronds swaying in the salt air, stretches of pale sand where the waves lapped gently. It was so different from the stony coasts of Europe, so soft and inviting, that some wondered if it was a dream. The sailors leaned over the rails, breathing in scents they had not known at sea, the sweetness of vegetation, the earthy dampness of soil, the faint resin of unfamiliar trees. For men who had lived for weeks with only the smell of brine, tar, and stale bread, these fragrances seemed impossibly rich. The waves themselves seemed calmer here, as if welcoming the ships. Birds wheeled overhead, white against the sky, their cries unfamiliar. A few perched boldly on the rigging, as though curious about these strangers who had crossed the ocean. When the boats finally touched the shallows and men leapt into the surf, water splashing around their boots, a profound quiet descended. Each step on the sand was heavy with meaning. They were not just sailors anymore. They were witnesses to the unknown. Columbus himself stepped forward, bearing a banner marked with the cross and the emblems of Spain. He carried it not with the force of a conqueror, but with a solemn air, as if enacting a ritual. Behind him men knelt in the sand, pressing their lips to the ground. Some wept openly, overcome with relief at simply feeling solid earth beneath them. The land was claimed in the name of the Spanish crown, though for the men themselves it felt less like possession and more like deliverance. The sea had held them in its vast embrace, testing their endurance, and now the earth received them again. Soon after, figures emerged from the trees. Men and women of the islands, curious yet unafraid, approached the shore. Their skin glowed bronze beneath the sun. Their movements were fluid and calm, as though this moment, strange as it was, did not startle them. The Spaniards looked at them with wonder. These people bore no armour, carried no steel. Their ornaments were shells, beads, feathers. Their words were soft, musical, carried by gestures and smiles. The two groups regarded one another, neither fully understanding, yet both sensing the weight of the encounter. Columbus and his men offered beads, small bells and trinkets, which the islanders received with laughter and amazement. In return, they brought food, fruits of brilliant colours, gourds filled with water, and fish still fresh from the sea. It was not the language of speech that bound them in this first meeting, but the language of simple humanity, the sharing of sustenance, the exchange of glances, the curiosity of one people for another. As days unfolded, the sailors explored more of the island. They found streams running with clear water, trees laden with fruits they had never seen before, and bright birds whose feathers seemed painted by unseen hands. The air was warm but gentle, carrying scents of blossoms they could not name. Nights were filled with strange sounds, insects singing, leaves whispering in the breeze, the distant call of animals hidden in the forest. For men accustomed to the creaking of timbers and the howl of winds at sea, these sounds were almost otherworldly. Some wandered into the villages, where they found homes made not of stone but of woven palms, shaped into graceful arcs. Fires burned in the evening, and families gathered around them, their voices low, their faces lit with quiet joy. To the Spaniards, who had known months of hardship and fear, this life seemed impossibly gentle. Columbus wrote of the land as a paradise. He marvelled at the generosity of the people, their openness, and the richness of the soil. He imagined what could be planted here, what could be harvested, what wealth might lie hidden. Yet, beneath those thoughts, there was also wonder. For all the ambitions of crowns and empires, there remained the simple fact that these sailors had stood on a shore no European had known before. They had stepped into a space that, for them, was beyond the horizon of all prior maps. It was less an act of conquest than an awakening. The world was larger than they had been told, more mysterious, more abundant, more beautiful. And so, each night as the waves lapped gently at the sand, and as the stars rose above the palms, the men lay upon the earth and listened. They listened to the breathing of a world newly revealed to them. They listened to the silence between waves, to the rustle of unseen wings in the trees. And for the first time in many weeks, their dreams were not filled with hunger or fear, but with images of rivers, forests, and distant voices calling from the green shadows of the new land. The first days on the island had been marked by awe. The sailors, relieved to stand once more upon solid earth, regarded everything with the freshness of children. The trees, the fruits, the faces of the islanders all seemed to shimmer with strangeness and beauty. Yet as days passed into weeks, the novelty shifted. Wonder gave way to curiosity, and curiosity gave way to questions. The Europeans and the islanders found themselves bound together by necessity. They shared food, gestures, laughter. But woven into this fragile web of exchange were threads of misunderstanding, threads that would slowly tighten into knots neither side could easily untangle. Among the islanders, generosity was a way of life. Visitors were welcomed with open hands, offered fruits plucked from trees, or shells polished smooth by the sea. A fisherman, returning from the reef, would set down his catch before strangers as naturally as if he were feeding his own kin. To give was to affirm community. The Spaniards marvelled at this, and at first they responded in kind, handing over small beads, bells, and trinkets. The islanders laughed with delight, holding up the glittering objects to the sun, stringing them around their necks or tying them to their children's wrists. But here lay the first fracture. To the islanders, the gifts of the strangers seemed tokens of friendship, not measures of worth. To the Europeans, however, accustomed to a world where trade bound the fabric of life, such exchanges carried different meanings. What the islanders gave freely, the sailors interpreted as signs of abundance, of naivety, of opportunity. Without a common tongue, gestures became the bridge. A hand laid upon the heart, a smile, a pointing finger, the raising of an object followed by a questioning glance. It worked well enough, yet even gestures could mislead. A nod that in one culture meant agreement might in another mean confusion. A wave that suggested farewell might instead signal invitation. There were moments of comedy, sailors trying to mimic the islanders' movements, only to be met with peals of laughter. And there were moments of quiet failure, where a simple misunderstanding left both sides puzzled, each walking away convinced of a meaning the other had not intended. Over time, the Europeans began to believe they understood more than they truly did, and this illusion of comprehension, fragile and mistaken, was often more dangerous than ignorance itself. It was not long before the subject of gold arose. For the sailors sent forth under the banner of crowns, gold was both dream and mandate. Columbus in particular had promised riches to his patrons, and his gaze soon fell upon the ornaments worn by the islanders. Some wore small pieces of beaten metal, hammered thin, hanging from cords. When asked through signs where such ornaments came from, the islanders pointed inland toward distant hills or across the water to other islands. They smiled as they gestured, for to them gold was no more precious than shell or feather, another gift of the earth. But to the Europeans those gestures burned with significance. They imagined rivers of gold, mountains filled with treasure, kingdoms waiting to be claimed. In the islanders' casual adornments, they saw confirmation of legends whispered for centuries. What was freely given as decoration was received as promise, a promise that would fuel ambitions far greater than the small exchanges of those first days. The Spaniards often interpreted friendliness as submission. When the islanders bowed slightly in greeting, it was taken as reverence. When they brought food without asking anything in return, it was read as tribute. When they touched the strangers' faces or garments in curiosity, it was seen as admiration. But none of these gestures had such meanings. The islanders lived within their own rhythms of generosity and kinship, not within the hierarchies of Europe. What they intended as welcome was received as acknowledgement of foreign authority. In this subtle misreading lay the seeds of later sorrow. The Spaniards, convinced of their superiority, imagined themselves masters where they were only guests. The islanders, trusting and open, did not see the shadow this misunderstanding would one day cast. The sailors, weary of hard biscuits and salted meat, marvelled at the abundance of fruits, roots, and fresh fish. They tasted sweet guavas, soft cassava bread, and cool water from gourds. To them, these meals were not only nourishment but revelation. Yet food, too, became a ground for misunderstanding. For the islanders, meals were communal, shared without measure. To the Europeans, accustomed to scarcity, the abundance seemed inexhaustible. They did not see the quiet labour behind each harvest, the balance of give and take that sustained village life. Similarly, faith coloured their exchanges. Columbus carried with him not only banners, but a conviction of divine mission. He saw in the islanders' openness a readiness for conversion, a people waiting to be brought under the sign of the cross. But the islanders already lived within a web of spirits and forces, a world suffused with meaning invisible to European eyes. Their silence in matters of religion was mistaken for absence, their rituals unseen, their gods unrecognised. For a time, peace endured. Children followed the sailors with laughter. Women wove garlands of flowers for the strangers, who wore them awkwardly but with smiles. At night, fires lit the beaches, and voices mingled, uncomprehending, yet filled with warmth. And yet beneath the surface, tensions gathered. A borrowed tool not returned. A word misunderstood. A gesture of authority where none was owed. Each side moved within its own understanding of the world, and in the small spaces between those understandings, cracks began to form. In his journals, Columbus described the islanders as innocent, generous, and open. But woven into his words were also other thoughts, of service, of conquest, of opportunity. He saw both the beauty of their lives and the ease with which they might be bent to European aims. What he missed, perhaps, was the fullness of what stood before him, a people with their own histories, their own rhythms, their own unspoken wisdom. The first meetings between the old world and the new were not yet battles, not yet chains, not yet sorrow. They were gestures across a divide. Gestures filled with beauty, but also with blindness. For in those first exchanges, where laughter and gifts passed easily from hand to hand, there already lingered the shadows of all that would follow. The island had seemed at first like a paradise. Its trees bowed beneath the weight of fruit, its shores gleamed with shells, its people welcomed strangers with a generosity that felt endless. For the weary sailors, it was a place of rest, a balm after storms and hunger. But even in a garden, shadows lengthen with time. The first weeks of joy gave way to subtler feelings. Curiosity shifted into suspicion, gratitude into expectation, friendship into something more fragile. Beneath the soft rustle of palms and the laughter of children, faint currents began to stir, currents that would one day swell into storms. This was how tension was born, not in battles, but in small misunderstandings, in unspoken assumptions, in the daily press of need and desire. The sailors relied upon the islanders for food. At first, this sharing came easily. Bananas carried from groves, fish roasted over coals, cassava baked and handed out. But as days turned to weeks, the balance began to shift. For the islanders, generosity was bound by rhythm. Food was grown, gathered, or caught according to cycles. To share freely was natural, but to feed an entire ship's crew daily strained the pattern of life. The fishermen found themselves returning with lighter baskets. The gardens harvested more quickly than usual. To the sailors, however, the abundance seemed unending. They could not see the invisible lines of labour, of season, of restraint. They asked for more, assuming there would always be more. What to the islanders was sharing, to the Europeans became provisioning, and in this shift lay the first quiet burden. One day, a sailor borrowed an axe. It was a small thing, a metal tool prized aboard the ships but unknown on the island. He used it to cut wood for repairs, then set it aside. When it was not returned, questions arose. To the sailor, it was a matter of negligence. To the islanders, it was something else. The tool had been taken, and within their sense of justice, the taking of what was not freely given was theft. Voices rose, hands gestured sharply. For the first time, laughter gave way to unease. The axe was eventually found and returned, yet something intangible had shifted. A thread of trust, once unbroken, now held a knot. Columbus began to see himself not merely as a guest, but as a ruler. In his mind, the island belonged to his sovereigns, its people subjects to be guided, even commanded. He planted crosses in the earth, banners in the sand, gestures that to him signified possession. To the islanders, these acts were puzzling but not alarming. They saw the strangers carrying out strange rituals, foreign signs that held no place in their world. They nodded politely, unaware that these symbols carried a claim that would one day weigh heavily upon them. This gap between intent and understanding widened silently. The Spaniards saw obedience where there was only courtesy, submission where there was only hospitality. Authority, once imagined, soon began to seek expression. Among the islanders, women moved freely, gathering fruit, tending children, laughing openly in the presence of men. To the Europeans, accustomed to stricter boundaries, this openness was striking and at times misinterpreted. Admiration sometimes blurred into presumption. A smile meant as kindness was mistaken for invitation. The sailors, long at sea and starved of female company, read into gestures what was not offered. Some islanders were offended, others bemused, still others wary. In these delicate crossings of boundary, misunderstandings deepened. What was natural for one world became misread in another, planting seeds of discord in moments as quiet as a glance. Gold returned again and again to the Spaniards' thoughts. Small ornaments worn by islanders fascinated them, igniting dreams of wealth. Each time they asked where it came from, the answers pointed further afield, to rivers, to mountains, to other islands. The islanders answered casually, but the Europeans heard promises. They saw in every vague gesture a map, in every word a treasure. What was simple adornment became the seed of conquest. This hunger, insistent and unyielding, was invisible to the islanders. They did not know how deep gold burned in European imagination. To them it was decoration. To their visitors it was destiny. The longer the Spaniards stayed, the more they expected. At first, a shared meal was wonder enough, but soon requests became routine, then demands. A hut to sleep in, canoes for fishing, guides for journeys inland. The islanders provided, though their smiles grew thinner. Hospitality, once effortless, now felt like burden. They were too kind to refuse outright, too patient to protest loudly, but unease flickered at the edges of every exchange. The sailors did not notice or chose not to. For them, the island remained a paradise, its people endlessly generous. They did not hear the sighs behind the laughter, the silences that stretched a little longer each day. It was not one great clash, but many small ones. A tool misplaced, a request refused, a gesture misunderstood. Each incident passed quickly, resolved with laughter or silence, yet each left a faint scar. The Spaniards began to speak among themselves of the islanders' simplicity, their easy compliance, their supposed weakness. The islanders spoke more quietly, wondering at the strangers' demands, their insatiable hunger, their odd claims of possession. Neither side fully understood the other. Both carried assumptions unspoken yet powerful, and in those assumptions lay the seeds of all that would follow, the tightening of bonds into chains, the turning of friendship into domination. Looking back, it is easy to trace the arc of history, how these first tensions grew into conflict, how paradise turned to sorrow. Yet in those early days the seeds were so small, so ordinary, that they could almost be overlooked. Hospitality strained, curiosity misread, authority assumed, desire unbounded. History often begins not with battles but with misunderstandings, and in the quiet exchanges of that island, beneath the palm trees and the stars, the first shadows fell upon what had begun in laughter. The sea had carried them far, and the island had received them gently. For a time, it seemed that the rhythm of waves and palms would carry strangers and hosts into a harmony that might endure. But harmony, once strained, rarely holds forever. Where tension once lay hidden, conflict now began to surface. Small grievances hardened, assumptions deepened, and needs pressed against limits. In the gap between worlds, kindness began to fray, and shadows lengthened into the first shapes of violence. It began, as such things often do, with a misunderstanding too small to be believed. A sailor accused a young islander of taking a dagger. The islander denied it. Voices rose, gestures sharpened. In the heat of frustration, a blow was struck, one open hand across another's cheek. The sound was sharp, shocking the air like the crack of a branch. Silence followed, heavier than any storm. The islander's eyes burned with humiliation, though he said nothing. He walked away, and the sailor, perhaps uneasy, laughed to fill the space. But the laugh carried no joy. In that moment, a line had been crossed. What had once been only words, only suspicion, had now become touch force, humiliation, violence. That night, one of the sailors found his hammock slashed. Another discovered food missing from a basket. No harm was done to their bodies, but the message was clear. Resentment had begun to take form. The Spaniards muttered among themselves. They saw in these small acts a challenge, even a rebellion. The islanders, for their part, saw only justice, a balancing of shame with shame, of loss with loss. Neither side recognized that the other lived by different laws of dignity. The sailors thought in terms of order and punishment, the islanders in terms of balance and honour. What seemed to one a crime was to the other a restoration. One of the sharpest moments of conflict came when boundaries between men and women were crossed too far. A sailor, emboldened by drink and misunderstanding, pursued a woman who had not invited his touch. She cried out. Her kin rushed forward, voices became shouts, and soon hands gripped clubs, knives, fists. The fight was brief, broken apart by others before blood could flow freely. But blood was drawn all the same. A cut on a sailor's arm, a bruise on an islander's face. For the first time, bodies carried the marks of open struggle. The woman was led away, trembling. The sailor nursed his wound, muttering curses, and in the silence that followed, the fragile fabric of trust tore a little wider. Columbus, hearing these stories, began to see danger where once he'd seen opportunity. He ordered the men to keep their weapons close, to march in pairs, to show force when necessary. Crossbows were carried more visibly, swords unsheathed for even simple tasks. The islanders watched with narrowed eyes. To them, weapons had always been tools of hunting or defence, not displays of power. The sudden presence of iron and steel gleaming under the sun was not reassurance, but threat. What had once been curiosity towards strange tools now became unease. Children no longer laughed as freely when sailors entered the village. Mothers guided them indoors. The air thickened with wariness. One night, a hut near the beach caught fire. Flames leapt into the air, crackling, consuming palm thatch and bamboo. Islanders rushed with gourds of water, beating the flames with branches. Sailors stood nearby, some helping, others watching with suspicion. Whispers spread quickly. Had it been an accident, or had it been set deliberately? Fingers pointed in both directions. The islanders suspected drunken sailors, careless with embers. The Spaniards whispered of islanders seeking revenge. No proof was found. The fire was quenched, but not the distrust it fed. The scar of blackened earth remained, a dark reminder at the edge of the village. Columbus decided it was time to establish order. He gathered islanders before the cross he had planted, speaking of kings and queens, of God and law. Through gestures and fragments of words he demanded allegiance. The islanders nodded politely as they always had. To them the speech was little more than strange ritual. They did not grasp that he spoke of sovereignty, of subjugation. But Columbus saw their nods as consent, their silence as submission. And so he grew bolder, pressing for guides, for labourers, for constant supply. Hospitality, once freely given, was now demanded, and demand, once voiced, was heard not as request but as command. It came at last, inevitable as rain after clouds. A sailor accused of theft was struck by an islander with a club. He fell, bleeding from his scalp. His comrades surged forward, swords flashing. The clash was brief but fierce. One islander fell with a wound to his chest, another fled with bloodied arm. The Spaniards dragged their injured comrade back to the beach, shouting threats, vowing revenge. The village, shaken, grew silent. Women wept softly. Men stood guard with spears, though their hearts were heavy. The first blood had been spilled, and with it the island's innocence. In the days that followed, the air grew heavy with silence. Islanders no longer came to the beach to greet the ships. Laughter vanished from the clearings. Even the birds seemed quieter, as though the forest itself mourned. The Spaniards spoke of strategy, of defence, of conquest. The islanders spoke less, but their eyes carried a new wariness. The warmth that had once filled every meeting was gone. Conflict had broken the spell. Where once two worlds met in wonder, now they faced one another in fear. It is tempting to see this moment as inevitable, as though paradise could never have endured. Yet nothing in history is truly inevitable. Every word, every gesture, every decision could have bent the path another way. But in those days, the men of Spain carried within them a hunger too sharp, a vision too narrow, to see the islanders as equals. And the islanders, though generous, could not see the storm that approached with every request, every demand. So it was that the first conflicts arose, not as wars of nations, but as misunderstandings grown sharp, as needs unmet, as dignity wounded. A dagger misplaced, a laugh misread, a woman's cry, a single drop of blood. Small beginnings leading toward vast consequences. The ocean has always been a mirror of the human spirit, sometimes still and glass-like, sometimes restless, sometimes overwhelming. For Columbus and his companions, the voyage back to Spain would prove that discovery was only half the story. The return too had its quiet trials, its moments of reflection, and its lingering sense of uncertainty. What had been found was only beginning to be understood, and what had been lost could not yet be measured. This chapter lingers with them at sea, among their sails, their prayers, their worries, and their long, slow days under the restless Atlantic sky. The ships rocked gently in the calm Caribbean waters, sails loosened for departure. The settlement they had left behind, the fragile structure they called La Navidad, still smoked faintly from cooking fires, and the memory of the land's lush greenness hovered in the minds of the crew. They were leaving behind not only men and timber, but also the uncertain beginnings of a colony. Columbus himself lingered on deck as the shoreline receded. He must have wondered, would those who remained survive? Would the settlement thrive or collapse under strain? The answers were hidden in the future, like the horizon itself, retreating with every step forward. Once more, the ocean stretched ahead of them, an expanse of water and sky, where days blurred into one another. The crew had crossed it once before, but returning was different. Now they knew that land lay behind them, proof of new worlds. Yet ahead there remained the uncertainty of Spain, and of how their discovery would be received. The sea's moods shifted daily. One dawn would bring calm silver light across a polished sea, another day would break with dark clouds and the groan of timbers. The men had grown weary of salt pork and hard biscuit, yet there was also a sense of pride among them. Few had thought this voyage possible, and fewer still had imagined returning with stories to tell. In February of 1493, the Atlantic reminded them of its power. A storm arose, fierce, sudden, unrelenting. The ships were scattered, torn by the wind. The Nina, carrying Columbus himself, fought desperately against towering seas. Men clung to ropes, their voices lost in the roar of water and wind. For hours it seemed that all would be lost. Columbus, in his cabin, wrote hurried notes of what they had found. An account of the voyage, sealed in a barrel and cast into the sea in case the ships were swallowed. It was an act both of desperation and of faith. If they did not survive, perhaps their discovery might still reach Europe. The storm passed, as storms always do, but it left the men shaken, humbled, and more deeply aware of how thin the line was between survival and oblivion. After the storm, calm returned. The ocean stretched again into endless stillness, and the crew settled back into the long rhythm of waiting. Days were marked by the angle of the sun, the calls of gulls, and the slow progress of the stars across the night sky. The sailors spoke of home in hushed tones, some dreamed of warm hearths, others of the sound of market squares or the smell of bread fresh from the oven. Yet there was also a quiet unease. They carried news unlike any in living memory. News of lands, peoples, and riches unseen by European eyes. How would it be received? Would they be believed, or doubted, even scorned? In these silences, Columbus must have walked the deck with his thoughts heavy. He had risked everything, begged for support, endured mockery and delay. Now his proof lay in the hold. Strange fruits, gold trinkets, parrots, and the testimony of people brought with him. It would have to be enough.
After weeks adrift, land was spotted. The Azores, Portuguese islands scattered like stepping stones in the Atlantic. Relief washed over the crew as they neared safe harbor. Yet even here, challenges awaited. Columbus sought rest, but political tensions lingered. Portugal eyed Spain's voyages with suspicion. Their sailors and governors questioned Columbus, weighing his story, measuring his claims. For a brief time, he was detained, treated less as a hero and more as a man whose discoveries threatened established power. The stay in the Azores was short, but it reminded Columbus that the ocean was not his only trial. The rivalries of courts and kings could be as treacherous as any storm.
The Nina pressed on toward the Iberian Peninsula, carrying its passengers and its secrets. Off the Portuguese coast, Columbus was driven by weather into Lisbon itself. There, at last, he was granted an audience with King John II of Portugal. The meeting was delicate. Portugal had long sought a route to the Indies. Now, Columbus stood before their monarch, claiming to have found a way westward. There must have been a quiet tension in the hall, a weighing of words, a measuring of possibilities. Though treated with courtesy, Columbus could not linger. His allegiance lay with Spain, and Spain awaited his return.
In March of 1493, after months at sea, Columbus's ship at last approached the Spanish coast. The men gathered at the rail, straining for sight of land. The familiar outline of Europe rose slowly from the horizon, and the thought of home steadied their hearts. They had left as adventurers, uncertain and mocked. They returned as men carrying news that would change the known world. Yet they themselves were weary. their clothes salt-stained, their bodies lean from hardship. As the harbor came into view, a hush must have fallen. They had survived, and now their tale would begin to spread. Though land was sighted, recognition was not immediate. Columbus and his men disembarked not as conquerors, but as weary sailors with strange stories. Their return would soon send ripples across courts and kingdoms, but in these first days, it was quiet.
Letters were written, messengers dispatched, and the men sought food, warmth, and sleep. The noise of triumph would come later. For now, there was only the stillness of arrival, the relief of solid ground, and the knowledge that their long circle across the ocean was complete. Columbus perhaps walked the streets with both pride and apprehension. He had achieved what few thought possible, but he also knew that every achievement carries its shadow. What he had opened was vast, and its consequences could not yet be measured. The return voyage of Columbus was not a march of glory, but a slow, uncertain passage across the same ocean that had carried them west. And yet, in its quiet way, it was one of the most important journeys in human history. The bridge that carried news of new worlds from one shore to another. It reminds us that discovery is never a single moment, but a process of leaving, of enduring, of returning, and of sharing what was found. The sea had released them. The voyage had ended. And now the next trial began. Not one of storms and hunger, but of words, politics, and the fragile balance of power. Columbus had reached Spain once more, but Spain itself had changed. The court of Ferdinand and Isabella was alive with rumor, expectation, and doubt. Into this world, Columbus carried the weight of discovery. This chapter drifts slowly through those first encounters, the quiet moments of preparation, the cautious unveiling of wonders, and the slow, deliberate process by which a sailor's tale became a royal triumph. News traveled faster than ships. Word of Columbus's arrival preceded him, carried by riders and whispered across taverns and monasteries. Merchants, sailors, and clerks murmured of strange islands, of birds and colors not seen in Europe. By the time Columbus made his way inland, the court was already aware. What remained uncertain was whether the stories would match the man. Columbus's journey inland was itself a procession. He traveled slowly, pausing at towns and villages where crowds pressed close to see the sailor who claimed to have crossed the ocean. With him were objects from the voyage, bright feathered parrots, curious gold trinkets, fruits unknown to European tables. Each stop along the way was like a rehearsal for what awaited in Barcelona. Columbus must have felt the growing weight of expectation, like a storm gathering ahead. At the Spanish court, the anticipation was layered with intrigue. Courtiers debated among themselves, was this man a visionary or a reckless sailor who had stumbled into chance? Clerics wondered aloud whether the lands discovered could be drawn into the faith. Advisors whispered of Portugal, of rivalries, of treaties and maps and the shifting lines of power. The court was a world of silks and whispered alliances, and into it would soon step a man more familiar with tar, rope, and the endless sway of the sea. When at last Columbus stood before Ferdinand and Isabella, the air must have been heavy with silence. He entered not as a supplicant, as he had years before, but as a man bearing proof. He carried with him maps hastily drawn, journals filled with cramped lines of script, and tokens of lands across the ocean. The monarchs listened.
He spoke of fertile islands, of rivers that shimmered with promise, of people generous and welcoming, of resources that might enrich the crown. He spoke too of how the voyage had been guided by faith, of how the cross had been raised in those distant lands. The words fell like stones into water, sending ripples across the chamber. More than words were needed. Objects from the voyage were displayed before the court. Strange woven fabrics, carved ornaments, the bright feathers of tropical birds, dried fruits and seeds. Each was passed carefully from hand to hand, examined with wonder, disbelief, or greed.
And then there were the people, men from across the ocean, dressed now in Spanish garments, but carrying in their eyes the strangeness of another world. Their presence alone was a revelation, proof that the voyage had not been a dream. Ferdinand and Isabella were not given to impulsive decisions. They listened, they questioned, they weighed. Was this truly the edge of Asia? Was it something else entirely? The riches promised were not yet confirmed, the risks not yet fully measured. But they also knew the value of vision. Spain had been united through struggle and faith, and here was an opportunity to extend its reach across seas. To hesitate would be to lose ground to rivals. In their measured way, the monarchs began to see Columbus not as a dreamer, but as an instrument of empire.
At last, the recognition became formal. Columbus was named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, a title that would echo through history. He was confirmed as governor of the new lands, granted authority, wealth, and the promise of further voyages. For a man who had once been dismissed and doubted, it was a moment of triumph. And yet, titles are but words, and words can shift like sand. For now, however, they shone brightly, gilded by promise. When the celebrations ended, when the torches burned low and the courtiers returned to their chambers, Columbus must have felt the silence settle again. Triumph is never permanent. It is only a moment between storms. In that quiet, he may have thought of those he left behind at La Navidad, of the men building fragile walls against an unknown future. He may have thought of the ocean itself, always waiting, always calling. The courtly reception had crowned his discovery with honor, but the journey was far from over.
When the celebrations ended, when the torches burned low and the courtiers returned to their chambers, Columbus must have felt the silence settle again. Triumph is never permanent. It is only a moment between storms. In that quiet, he may have thought of those he left behind at La Navidad, of the men building fragile walls against an unknown future. He may have thought of the ocean itself, always waiting, always calling. The courtly reception had crowned his discovery with honor, but the journey was far from over. The banners had fallen, the applause faded, the last echoes of the royal hall drifted into memory. Columbus, once a wandering mariner, now stood elevated as Admiral of the Ocean Sea. His name had been spoken with honor, his voyage draped in triumph. Yet behind the gilded titles and parades, shadows began to stir. Empire does not begin with a single step, nor even with a single voyage. It begins in whispers, in contracts, in quiet calculations written in ledgers. It begins when maps are redrawn, when lines of power are measured against oceans yet to be sailed. This chapter enters that uneasy space between glory and consequence, the twilight of triumph where seeds of empire were planted, and with them the first threads of inevitable sorrow. For all his honors, Columbus was bound by promises. Gold, spices, fertile lands, these were the treasures he had spoken of, the rewards he had led his patrons to expect. Faith, too, was part of the pledge, the conversion of souls, the spreading of the cross.
But promises, once spoken in firelit chambers or carried on the rhythm of the sea, now became obligations in the light of the court. The crown did not simply celebrate, it counted. What had been given in titles must be returned in wealth. Spain was not alone in listening. Portugal watched closely, its own explorers already seasoned in Africa and the Indies. The Treaty of Tordesillas loomed, a line drawn across the map of the world like a sword across a table. Who would claim which half of the unknown? Who would profit and who would yield? The shadow of rivalry lengthened, stretching from Lisbon to Barcelona, from ocean to ocean. Columbus's discoveries were not merely lands, they were pawns in a game of power where every new island shifted the balance.
Among the most striking of the symbols Columbus had brought were not birds or gold, but people. The men taken from across the sea stood in strange garments, paraded through cities, displayed as proof of discovery. They were treated as curiosities, ambassadors, or trophies, depending on who observed. Their silence in the royal halls spoke volumes. What must they have thought, carried from their own shores into this maze of stone and silk, where their faces became evidence and their existence a testament to another's glory? Columbus dreamed of a second voyage, of colonies, of wealth beyond imagining. But even in his triumph there were murmurs of doubt. His journals spoke of gold, yet the fragments displayed were small. His maps were vague, drawn in haste, their accuracy uncertain. Some at court whispered that he had not reached Asia at all, but something else, lands unknown, of unclear value.
Dream and doubt intertwined, each feeding the other. It was the nature of empire's beginnings. Belief strong enough to move ships, doubt strong enough to demand proof. Far across the ocean, the small settlement of La Navidad waited, or perhaps already did not wait. Columbus had left men there, trusting in their ability to survive, to build, to hold the Spanish presence. But in Spain there was no word of them, only silence. The court celebrated the voyage, but Columbus must have carried that silence like a stone in his chest. Triumph at home was shadowed by the unknown fate of those left behind. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the voyage was no longer merely a matter of curiosity. It was an opportunity that demanded action. Advisors urged haste. Portugal would not wait, nor would other kingdoms. And so, plans began to take shape. Another voyage, larger, more deliberate, with settlers, supplies, and soldiers. Not just discovery, but possession. Not just fleeting visits, but permanence. What had begun as one man's quest for recognition was becoming an arm of empire, sharpened into policy. Gold had been promised, and gold would be demanded. Each feather, each trinket displayed at court, became a symbol of more to come. The hunger of empire was not subtle. It gleamed in the eyes of merchants, in the whispers of bankers, in the calculations of nobles eager for shares in future voyages. Columbus himself, carried by ambition, fueled this hunger with words. The shadow of gold stretched long, a glittering promise that would soon become a chain. The church, too, turned its gaze toward the new lands. Souls awaited conversion, or so it was said. Bishops and priests spoke of missions, of spreading the faith beyond the sea. To them, the voyage was not only a matter of trade or empire, but of eternal salvation. Yet faith, when mingled with conquest, often becomes shadowed. The cross, carried into new worlds, bore both promise and peril, mercy and demand. Even surrounded by honors, Columbus often seemed alone. His triumph did not erase the long years of doubt, nor the reality that he remained in many eyes a foreigner in Spain. He bore his titles proudly, yet he was ever aware of how swiftly favor could turn. In the nights after ceremonies, he must have felt again the endless rhythm of the sea, the quiet that courts could not provide. His triumph was real yet fragile as a ship upon a boundless ocean. Empire does not thunder into being. It unfolds quietly, like the spreading of ink across paper, like the slow tightening of a net. In the months after the reception, letters were written, contracts drafted, ships prepared. The seeds of conquest had already been sown. The shadows stretched outward across the Atlantic, toward shores where new settlements would rise and fall, where alliances would be made and broken, where futures would be reshaped beyond imagining. The courtly reception had been a moment of light, but it was in this shadowed aftermath that empire was truly born. The shadows of empire were not sudden, nor were they yet recognized for what they would become. To those in the court, they were simply opportunities, more ships, more voyages, more lands to claim. But history, when it looks back, sees more than banners and titles. It sees the quiet beginnings of a tide that would reshape continents, lives, and centuries. The applause in Barcelona had been loud, but beneath it was a softer sound. The rustle of parchment, the scratching of quills, the murmurs of ambition. And it was these sounds, more than cheers, that would echo longest in the centuries to come. And now, a voyage comes to its end. The sails are furled, the maps set aside, the voices of the past grow quiet once more. You have walked with explorers, stood in courts of kings, and felt the weight of shadows that stretched across oceans. It has been a long journey, one of triumphs, of questions, and of beginnings that still echo through time. But for tonight, let those echoes rest. Close your eyes. Let the waves carry you, and allow the old world to fade into dreams. Thank you for sharing this adventure, and until the next story, good night and sleep well.